All right, good morning, everyone. Thank you to David for the introduction and for the invitation. I also want to thank the World Press Institute and the America for Bulgaria Foundation and AEJ for making this event possible, and for James Fallows, American journalist in absentia, for connecting me with these important organizations. I know James wanted to be with us here very much, but it's an honor for me as someone who admires his work so much to speak here in his place. Okay, so just a few more words about me. David covered most of it. As he said, my name is Brian Beutler. I live and work as a journalist in Washington, D.C., and have for the better part of the past 18 years. In that time, I've held conventional beat reporting assignments, including several years covering the United States Congress. In more recent years, I've transitioned into opinion writing and editing, and I've tried to import the reporting skills and professional standards I gathered earlier in my career into my new role, which has taken me from a magazine called, as David mentioned, The New Republic, to my current role as editor-in-chief of Crooked Media. And if that name or term rings a bell, you now know, it was an epithet our last president used to deride the American news media. And that's not a coincidence. The founders of my company reappropriated the term because they're clever, but also to rob the term of some of its abusive power. Apart from our name, Crooked Media is best known for creating many successful podcasts. So these span the gamut from interview shows to panel format shows to limited run serials. We produce podcasts about politics, foreign affairs, women's issues, sports, the law, American culture, and on and on. Our serials have included a comedic biography of Edith Wilson, who was the wife of U.S. President Woodrow Wilson. We produced an exploration of the strained and broken promises the U.S. government has made to our native tribes and how those broken promises affect life in those regions today. And we even did a narrative reporting project investigating whether the famous Scorpions ballad, Wind of Change, was, and this is not a joke, secretly written by the CIA to undermine the Soviet Union. The hosts of our shows tour. They do live events. We publish written articles and newsletters. We produce video series. And all of that has given us a pretty good grasp on what I'll be discussing with you all today, which is a growing problem of disinformation and the role journalists can and should play in combating it. So disinformation is obviously not a new problem in the U.S. or anywhere else people practice politics. I don't want to come across as naive about that. But the current generation of journalists working in the U.S. is grappling anew with the phenomenon of powerful political actors openly, proudly in many cases, embracing disinformation, agitprop, Orwellian lying, with the purpose of subverting the vocation of journalism itself, to make as many people as possible distrust journalists, so that they seek information from partisan sources or other sources that aren't bound by the ethical standards to which our reporters are expected to adhere. A top advisor to our former president described this objective vividly as flooding the zone with excrement, though he didn't use the word excrement. And the avowed idea is to escape the unique check that a free press provides against public corruption, extremism, dishonesty, by inundating the public sphere with outrages and lies and diversions, so that misgovernance or abuses of power go unnoticed, or so that when they are noticed, the public has a difficult time discerning truth from fiction or knowing whom to believe. Combating this kind of disinformation or this information warfare is often a thankless task, and it would probably be a hopeless one, but for the ethical standards I alluded to just a moment ago. So let me say a bit more about those. The American journalism industry is highly fragmented, but for this morning's purposes and for simplicity's sake, I'm going to focus on national political journalism in America, which is loosely divided between what we call our mainstream news media and our independent news media. So mainstream media encompasses our largest and most influential newspapers, television stations, and other outlets. It's typically corporate-owned, or it's financed publicly. Practitioners in the mainstream try and are heavily pressured to avoid betraying any hint of political ideology in their final work product. Independent media outlets, by contrast, are generally smaller. They're financed by donations, ads, philanthropists, or a mix of those three things. They're often, though not always, more ideological in nature, and they tend to be a bit more specialized. They are also where I've chosen to spend most of my career. So as different as these approaches to journalism are, they share one crucial thing in common, which is that reporters at both kinds of outlets overwhelmingly view it as their obligation to ascertain what is true and share that information with their audiences. There are very strong cultural pressures in our industry against knowingly reporting false information and in favor of correcting accidental errors when those inevitably happen. The whole enterprise rests on public trust, which in turn obligates journalists to approach our jobs in good faith and with some degree of rigor. Systematic disinformation nevertheless presents our journalists with a big challenge. So I mentioned countervailing pressures a moment ago, and I want to dwell on those for a minute because they're important, because purveyors of disinformation tend to try to exploit those pressures. For instance, at the individual level, journalists want to be seen by their sources and their audiences as even-handed. They want to be able to draw sourcing from across the political spectrum. They want readers and viewers and listeners alike to think that they give public figures comparable levels of scrutiny and a comparably fair shake. But that provides a distinct advantage to powerful disinformers or to propagandists, because they can deny reporters access to information or to powerful people, or deem those reporters to be politically biased if those journalists aren't sufficiently deferential. So that's the essential tension between journalists who want to be brave truth tellers and the sources who seek to manipulate them or jerk them around. And so confronted with actors like these, I argue it is fundamentally the obligation of journalists to resist the countervailing pressures and fall back on that ideal that links us, whether we're in the mainstream or whether we're from the independent media. And that is that journalists are fact finders, and that our most solemn obligation is not to be well liked by powerful people or of any particular use to them, but to ascertain what is true and share that information with our audiences. So with all that said, I don't want to sound too exacting or demanding here. Journalists are people. I am a person. And it'd be asking too much to expect all of us to meet all of these obligations in every instance. But I'd argue that getting it right in most instances requires a combination of two character traits. First, grit, by which I mean a degree of mental and physical courage. And second, integrity, by which I mean the ability to choose what's right over what's easy and to form the mental habits required to know the difference between the two. In the US context, the physical courage aspect of grit is thankfully not a huge consideration. I note this with full awareness, and with even more awareness last night after our dinner, that in many other countries, people are routinely imprisoned and or killed for whistleblowing or reporting what's true. The US, by contrast, provides journalists strong legal protections, and it is uncommon for powerful people or their allies to target journalists with violent retribution. But this background expectation that we share in the US of a free press is changing in some alarming ways. US politicians have always scapegoated journalists. There have been decades-long campaigns to discredit the media or pressure members of the media into doing the bidding of one party or another. But more recently, that kind of adversarial relationship has given way to something more like incitement. So the former president didn't just popularize the term crooked media. He deemed professional journalists in our country enemies of the people. And he helped routinize a new practice in the US of singling out individual journalists by name for scorn. And when that happens, those journalists inevitably experience harassment on social media. They experience more harassment in person at public events, and they frequently receive death threats in the mail. At a more systemic level, disinformers want to erode the legal protections in the US that make our journalism possible, and have even sought to abuse government power to punish news outlets that they deem insufficiently deferential to their political leaders. With that as the backdrop, grit then requires journalists, editors, producers, news executives, all of us, to anticipate these pressures, prepare for them, and not let them influence our decisions about what to report or when or how. Unfortunately, that's the easy part. The personal integrity piece of the puzzle is both harder to define and harder to institutionalize. Leaders of major national news institutions are at pains not to alienate segments of the population or their advertisers, and that incentive tempts them to dilute the truth-telling mission in favor of taking a gentler touch, of treating truth as in some sense impossible to ascertain, right? He said this, his opponent said something else, and we leave discovering the truth of the matter to you, the news consumer. Practicing journalists in my country fear the accusation of partisan bias, and knowing this, disinformers level accusations of partisan bias promiscuously. And the result is that journalists will frequently generate false equivalences between all of our political actors, irrespective of the public record, which often shows that some political actors are more corrupt or extreme or dishonest than others. In some cases, our journalists will simply skip the part of the job that entails identifying and correcting false claims. In other words, they become pass-throughs for the very disinformation they are supposed to be on guard against. And the worst thing about it is that the compromises that journalists make with themselves, these particular compromises, they do nothing to slow or stop the bad faith accusations of political bias. So resisting these pressures is more complicated in many ways than simply being willing to endure online harassment. We face constant tension between our obligation to report on the words and deeds of powerful disinformers and to simultaneously limit the spread of false claims. And it's not always clear where one ends and the other begins. But the good news is that journalism's internal and external critics in the United States are keenly aware of these problems, and they provide constructive counterpressure on journalists not to become pass-throughs for disinformation. And they have identified several tactics that I believe can help insulate journalists from these bad incentives. So let's talk about some of those. We often refer to one common mistake journalists make in the US as privileging the lie. That is the repetition or re-airing of false claims without corrective context. Or in a way that buries the corrective context so that consumers might absorb the lie, but not the corrective. Articles in our newspapers are often written and structured in a way that privileges the lie, right? Politician X will say something outrageous, and only several paragraphs later will we learn that it was also simply made up. Reporters who cover events in real time often do so on Twitter, and when they do, they frequently, maybe even unthinkingly, relay lies politicians tell without identifying them as lies. And in doing so, they privilege the lie. In its most familiar form, privileging the lie entails pointing live television cameras at dishonest brokers and broadcasting their words unfiltered, in some cases to millions of news consumers. So one tactic we use to avoid that particular error, the pointing the camera at liars error, is to monitor for news, which is to say just do journalism. Send the reporters in, record the newsmaker, cover the event, but only afterwards provide consumers a complete account of what transpired, the newsworthy truths and the lies, so long as they're clearly identified and corrected. When a lie is newsworthy, journalists can create what we somewhat awkwardly refer to in our industry now as a truth sandwich. The idea is to surround newsworthy false claims with correctives. So for instance, a politician might falsely claim that an election has been stolen. A journalist, I think, would be remiss to simply repeat the claim. But she could report, one, the true outcome of the election, followed by two, the fact that one of the contestants in the election contends that the election was stolen, and ending on three, that this politician's own aides dispute the accusation, right? So the order there is truth, lie, truth, which I guess technically makes it a lie sandwich. But whatever you call it, or however you structure it, the idea is to resolve the dilemma that arises when an intentional effort to mislead the public, such as by claiming an election has been stolen, is itself newsworthy. Not all lies, I should say, and provocations are newsworthy, or rather, they often aren't as newsworthy enough, sufficiently newsworthy to replace other more consequential stories, kick them off of our front pages, our news programming, our social media. Sometimes when they're flooding the zone with excrement, the best thing to do is to get out of the zone. The US cable news host Rachel Maddow likes to use an expression which was coined, I believe, from the Nixon era, which is watch what they do, not what they say. And that is, in fairness, a slightly categorical recommendation because journalists obviously have to do both things. But the point is to remind journalists to use considered judgment about whether a provocation is genuinely consequential or revelatory, or whether it's just meant to distract journalists and waste their limited resources. Okay, so we have not privileging the lie. We have monitoring for news. We have our sandwiches, ensconcing lies in the context of truth. And we have emphasizing deeds over words. That's not meant to be any kind of comprehensive list, but it hopefully illustrates the kinds of cues professional journalists can use to guide us through the minefields of disinformation. Then the last challenge is to make sure people actually encounter journalism. We can be perfectly rigorous and clear in our communication, but if nobody hears or reads it, we might as well be practicing in front of a mirror. And in the US, that means packaging news to reach people on platforms that weren't really built for news delivery. If you poll or interview young people in America, approximately ages 18 to 35, you'll find that very few of them consume news by reading newspapers or watching news programming on television or scrolling through the websites of news gathering outlets. They learn about the world on TikTok and on Twitter, and they learn from their peers after news has already been transformed from the raw material of news gathering into morsels of information that have spread virally online or through their communities. And I don't know how to solve that problem exactly, other than to say it's important for journalists to experiment with storytelling techniques and distribution methods. It's important because cluttering the internet with junk and lies meant to appear trustworthy is depressingly very easy. People do it for a living or to advance their political agendas or both. And we can't say we've done everything in our power to combat disinformation if we cede that train to them. So I think it's fair to expect all of this from journalists. It's what we endeavor to do at Crooked Media. But journalists could use our help, too. We should be responsible consumers with good mental habits of our own. We should have what we in the US call high media literacy so that we don't easily get taken in by fakers. We should criticize bad journalism when we see it. We should reform existing journalism institutions and create new ones to better align the incentives so that journalism as practice become coterminous with the values that inspired people to become journalists in the first place. And if we, journalists and critics and consumers, do all of these things well, most of the time, society will be better off and we'll be able to say we did our part. And with that, I am happy to take a few questions.
I'm going to slow you down because the translators are talking a little slower for the translation.
My apologies.
Any questions? Here we got a microphone coming your way.
Thank you. So my name is Darina Sarauska. I'm a former journalist now teaching future journalists. And off of the last thing you said, that we need to teach future journalists, in my case, that's how I read it, to experiment with distribution and platforms and meet people where they are. Mm-hmm. Would you care to maybe give examples of some of the US media that you think, or journalists that you think are successful in doing that?
Off the cuff, it's hard to think of specific examples. A lot of the independent media is done, started online, so that our independent media companies typically don't have the resources to begin with a TV station or a newspaper or even a magazine. So since they're web native, it started simply with written text just on the internet as opposed to in a print publication. And then they were able to incorporate video, and then that evolved into social media. And because of that, I think our smaller outlets, and I would include ourselves among them, really from day one sort of think about how to present our information in a way that meets people, as you said, where they are, and that travels well in those spheres. It makes people want to share what we have to say. Our larger institutions, I mean, the New York Times is our flagship newspaper, and they have incredible resources, and they do these special projects that are extremely labor and technology intensive, and many of them are wonderful and beautiful. And they do, because of how high the quality is, travel well online, and they can become sort of internet sensations on their own. But the practice of reporting and what journalists do day in, day out is still very rooted in pre-internet ideas. I mean, journalists are on Twitter. Journalists some of them have TikTok accounts, and they use them to reach audiences. But mostly what they do is they show up, they talk to their sources, and they write copy for their newspapers or prepare copy for their TV programs, and then they call it a day. And unless they happen to have hit on a very important scoop, most of the work that they do ends up forgotten very quickly, even if it's very important. So I may not have answered your question exactly in offering you specific examples of how it's done well, but we're always kind of learning, and I think that we're one step behind where the kids are always, and so it's just going to always be a challenge in that way.
Just a quick question. My name is Ivan Christoph, and I remember as a student at the University of Toronto, we use the Metropolitan Police to validate our information. Mm-hmm. Now, in the new millennium, do you use Google, Facebook to have any authentication of information for your story?
We have it's very common in the U.S., particularly for mainstream journalists and for our regional journalists, to be fairly uncritical of law enforcement authorities in general, and to treat even their on-the-record assertions as presumptively truthful. And what the internet has done is shown how dangerous that can be, or how frequently journalists are misled by law enforcement actors. And so the best of us do what we do with all other sources that we are more appropriately skeptical of, which is don't treat it as presumptively true. Don't omit it. Don't pretend it wasn't said, but try to independently verify it using the tools you mentioned or other tools. If you're talking about crime, there are communities where people experience the crime, and you can go talk to them and see if you can figure out what happened independently from government authorities. And we're in the midst of a big discussion in U.S. journalism now about sort of dialing back the credulity of official government sources of all kinds, but particularly law enforcement.
Irina?
Thank you. My question is maybe mostly connected with the Bulgarian media scene.
Okay.
But when you're speaking about this truth sandwich, the lie in between,
yep,
it means that we have to imagine a package of information.
Right.
But I will give you an example. In Bulgaria, the politicians, but also the media, is misusing live broadcasting. When it is live, when it is on air, it's almost not possible actually to do the truth sandwich, because it needs post-production, it needs another means of, or even using the tools that are there, and editorial capacity of the newsrooms could not be used. I will give you an example with the politicians' misusage of live broadcasting. It is going even to the extent of not going to press conference rooms, but just broadcasting from on Facebook, live streaming on Facebook through via your personal computers, or from your bedroom, something like this. How could this advice of yours for a truth sandwich work in such circumstances? And do you think that we should reconsider, or at least be aware of the traps live broadcasting or streaming is putting us in?
Yes. We have this problem in the US too. Prior to the last administration, it was not, in my recollection at least, the standard practice when somebody was holding a press conference or giving a speech to presumptively just air it live without without interruption, and then let them say whatever they want, and then you have to go back through everything they said to correct any errors that were made. And so the television outlets that have done that in the U.S. have come under a great deal of criticism for exactly the reasons you mentioned. And the best solution we have is this monitor for news idea. Sometimes a political figure, a government official will schedule a press conference, and it's hard not to take the event live, especially if it's an emergency situation like with COVID. But often these are political rallies essentially dressed up as news events. And in those cases, what we recommend television stations do is alert their viewers that the event is happening and promise them that we will bring you the important bits of it when it's over, and do the post-production aspect of it, and then bring lengthy clips. You know, don't try to be shady about it and misrepresent what was said at the. Genuinely give them a good representation of what was said at the event, but also that way you can make the truth sandwiches out of the morsels. You don't want to omit the fact that a politician held an event and told a bunch of lies, but you can then air the lies advertised as such, and it limits the damage that the lies can do, or the ability of the politician to convince people that the lies were true because he got to them first and no one was there to call them what they were. They get around this, as you alluded to. We call it disintermediating. We have so many ways of reaching people. Our presidents are on Twitter, and there's no way to stop them from doing that. But we can be responsible in not simply sensationalizing what they said without, if it is dishonest, referring to it as such, and maybe trying to get to the bottom of why it is they're trying to mislead people in the first place.
Over here.
Thank you, Yvette Chernev. I'm an author and analyst. My question is about Twitter. What do you think about Elon Musk's takeover of Twitter? And do you think Twitter needs more moderation or less moderation?
I think it has not gone very well so far. There was a period, at least from the perspective of U.S. journalists and U.S. political actors, around 2015 or 2016, when Twitter had become pretty unusable because the site was so flooded with not just bots and spammers, but paid trolls and neo-Nazis and white supremacists, and they would organize harassment campaigns against journalists. So if you're a journalist trying to use Twitter as a reporting tool, and every time you do, your account gets swarmed with people calling you racial epithets, it's both an unpleasant place to be and a place where your point gets lost because people see that everything you report gets turned into this sort of fiasco. And so that's when Twitter imposed some higher standards against harassment, and not just trying to avoid violence per se. And it became better. Obviously not perfect. It's sort of a trade-off because Twitter is such a powerful tool for news gathering and news reporting and news aggregating. And what Musk has done so far seems to be to bring us back to about 2015 or 2016, or at least that's in progress right now. And that, I guess we should be so lucky that that's the extent of it, because he has other business interests that are reliant on powerful governments, and we don't know how those two things are going to come into tension with each other, whether letting neo-Nazis in the U.S. back on Twitter and calling that a matter of free speech is, it's portrayed as something being done for principled reasons, but is it something being done on behalf of people protesting in Iran or China if he happens to be dependent on those governments for money? So we don't know. And if you want to go to even darker places, He, as the private owner of Twitter, has access to private communications of dissidents. It's not hard to imagine very bad worst-case scenarios of what he could do with that information. You know, this is speculative. I want to be clear. There's no indication that it has happened or will happen or is part of his plan. But he is cross-pressured in a way that I think should concern us, and that's forward-looking. But already, the quality of discourse on the material has been degraded because the people who were expelled from the platform for trying to make it inhospitable to journalism are now back.
Paulina, WPI alumni from Finland.
Hello, everybody. My name is Paulina Grimm. My first time in Bulgaria, and I really enjoy being here. We mentioned TikTok here, and we are very concerned about Twitter. But I am more concerned about TikTok because we know how it's tied to the Chinese government, and all the Western kids are very involved with TikTok. So I personally am a bit petrified by it. So what is your response to this?
I agree with you. I don't have a TikTok account. I have, you know, the young people on there that create things are very talented. They make me laugh sometimes. But I only see what they make piecemeal when friends send it to me because I don't have an account. And yes, I mean, for some of the same reasons I said it's reasonable to be concerned about Musk's ownership of Twitter because he's cross-pressured by foreign government interests. TikTok is a foreign government interest, so it creates some of the same questions, like to what end is all that information being collected and repurposed? And I don't know what you do about it. I mean, I just don't know. There are discussions in our Congress about what to do about it, but they come into tension with some of our other laws and values about free speech, free expression, and telling our citizens that they can't use a platform that they love and are addicted to would be a hard sell. So it's a very thorny problem. All I can say is that I understand why you're concerned about it, and I share some of those concerns.
Can we get in there?
It's fine either way.
Okay, so good. I'm sorry.
No worries. Dean Starkman, I'm a journalist based in Budapest. Hey, Brian.
Hi.
Great talk. Everyone's totally plugged in. I wanted to see two questions or two meta things. One is journalists always tend to see the struggle between truth and falsehood as the supply side problem. Who's going to get their version out first? But of course, there's also a demand side problem, meaning people are really looking for stuff that confirms their thing, and they go into their thing. So that's like one thing I'm kind of curious about how you deal with that. And then I'm really happy about these questions about the platforms because it's not like a ring where two wrestlers are wrestling truth and falsehood. So it's not like that at all. It's like these are not neutral spaces. These are places that are controlled by algorithms that tend to take people to where they already want to go. So I know we have long kind of question, but it's sort of like this water we're swimming in is to be aware of like how to reimagine or think about the space that we're working in, the internet, and which is dominated by really a handful of platforms, TikTok, Twitter, Facebook, and that type of thing. How do we even think about addressing that space, which was not imposed by some deity? It came up because of capitalism, et cetera.
Right. Yeah. We talk about gatekeepers in the U.S. and prior to the internet, what people, the news was just a handful of enormous platforms, and if you read them or watched them, you had the same information as everyone else. But even then, there was Father Coughlin, and we had plenty of disinformation and conspiracy theory prior to the internet age, and we had plenty of people doing what you're referring to, confirmation bias. They want to consume the media that confirms what they already believe about the world. I don't think that you can eliminate that, but what I think you can do, I mean, we saw it happen after our last election, or the 2020 election, which is that Fox News, a conservative, sort of Republican Party television station, reported the outcome of the election accurately, and so the president told his supporters, get your information from these other, even more extreme sources of information. And people followed his advice, and they went and they found their information elsewhere. There's another side to it, which is that as strong as our protections are in the U.S., you can't defame people. You can't maliciously smear them if you know that you're telling lies. And what some of those outlets that Mr. Trump directed his followers to did was they defamed the companies that made the vote counting equipment, and so now they're facing enormous financial judgments against them because it's one thing to seek out opinion or even conspiracy theories that can confirm your belief, but if that opinion writing or opinion television or conspiracy theory fodder veers into defamatory territory, there's a penalty to be paid. So that creates a disincentive in one direction. And the other aspect of it is, I guess there's sort of a gauche aspect of it, which is political, and one is sort of aspirational and values-based, which is that I think most people think lying on purpose to mislead people is kind of gross. And people don't raise their children to do that or to admire that or to want to go into that line of work. And so when people who take their responsibilities as journalists ethically expose that, we hope that there's a political price to be paid for the people who are behind it. And in our actual last election, the one that we just had a couple weeks ago in the U.S., there's some evidence to the effect that the candidates most outwardly and unapologetically involved in this systemic disinformation stuff, they did worse than just about any other candidates running. So it's not, you can't solve human nature, but I think we have pretty powerful tools to limit the amount of harm people's incentives can bring on the public sphere, both in our legal system and within journalism itself.
Michael?
Yeah, Brian, thanks for your comments. They're very interesting and very useful. I want to go back to something you were talking about in terms of reaching a younger audience. I think typically in the US, podcasts do reach a younger audience compared to, say, broadcast television. I want to ask you some advice, guidance, tips you might have, places like Bulgaria, other countries, and media outlets who might think about getting into the podcast space. What are the advantages, but also what are some practical thoughts on how to go about that? If you're a news organization, podcasts are growing in popularity here. What are the advantages, and what's just some practical advice?
The advantages are myriad. It's changing a little bit now, but we're still at fairly, not quite the infancy of podcasting, but it's still a pretty young format, especially to be professionalized. And so there's more room for experimentation. It reminds me of in the 2000s we had the blogosphere, which also professionalized and then just became absorbed by regular media. But it became a place where people could kind of sound out their ideas without the sort of over-exacting scrutiny of being on live television or writing in a newspaper. And so you can experiment a lot. You can delve into lots of topic matter. You can find experts on all topics and bring them on and talk to them for an hour or more about pretty much whatever you want. And then this is where the sort of personal integrity and ethics thing comes up. Since it's under scrutinized, if you make a mistake on a podcast, you're probably not likely to get a bunch of feedback telling you, hey, you screwed that up, you need to issue a correction. It's sort of on you to do that yourself. So those are the advantages, and also sort of one hidden risk. But what I would say is, I mean, you sort of want to, I think you, generally speaking, want to start with people who have some public profile to begin with. You know, it's not a coincidence that the founders of my company were well-known politicos before they founded Crooked Media. I'm not sure the identical product would have been successful without them being known and trusted by sort of the political news junkie culture. But but that means reporters, you know, opinion columnists, like retired politicians, and you know, the strategies for getting that off the ground, I think, are comparable to, you know, drawing attention to just about any product that we make as journalists is some degree of marketing. It's trying to get questions that are on people's minds answered. It's trying to break news. And you know, if you mix those elements together, you can build an audience that's large enough to at least make the podcast itself, that product, financially viable. So I hope that answers your question. I hope that at least is a start. There are other niche podcasts that are underwritten, or that they're you know, they're universities produce them. They don't have wide audiences, and they're not meant to. And those can be very valuable too, especially if you're, you know, if you're someone like me who, you know, a big part of what I do involves mining just the world of information out there. But if you're talking about a product that is sort of self-perpetuating and doesn't require injections of money from the outside or institutional support, you know, starting with people who are professional, ethical, and have a public profile, and, you know, a good sense for how to make conversations compelling, those are the ingredients.
There's a question here in the middle somewhere, and then there's a gentleman behind that I pointed out to, and maybe the next one can be there, but go ahead.
Hi, so my question is connected with the fact that a lot of young people nowadays tend to make really radicalized opinions on certain topics because of their attention span. Because of social media, a lot of people tend to only read titles of the articles, or to just like look at the TikTok or some tweet and decide where they stand on a certain point. How do you deal with that? Because we have to like adapt.
Well, if there's good news there, is that I think it's always kind of been like that, even before our attentions was spliced super thin by social media. How do you deal with it? I mean, I think you do the best you can. You know, like I alluded to in the speech, you want to try to, you know, if you know where they're getting their information, you know where to find them. If you believe that they are sort of being fed either by algorithms or by their own selection of who to follow, you know, junk, or if not junk, you know, highly incendiary, sort of misleading ideas about things, you try to compete in that space and provide alternative content that is equally digestible and fun and addictive, but that ideally conveys true things. And I mean, on the disinformation topic, you know, every election, our social media gets inundated with reporting about Election Day being a different day than it actually is. After Election Day, for instance. So vote Tuesday, November 12th, when the election was actually already over, which, you know, there might even be laws against it, but it happens all the time. And it's hard to measure what the impact of that kind of thing is. But, you know, what a lot of news outlets do, what we do, is try to package fun social information that has accurate information, and, you know, hopefully you reach some of the people in doing that are otherwise being inundated with agitprop or disinformation or sort of extreme content. But it goes back to what we were talking about before. Sometimes people just want what they want, and they're gonna stick with that kind of thing, and there's sort of very little you can do about it other than try. Just try as hard as you can.
Question in the middle back there.
Hi, my name is Bobby Angelov. I'm a media researcher and journalist, more likely academic extremist, something like this. You used a couple of times the words mental and journalist in the same sentence. Yeah, so it seemed right somehow, because when somebody asks me on the street, what are you working, and I say, oh, I'm a journalist, the most common reaction is, oh, nice, something like this. But when I ask a young person, what are you studying, and he or she said, I'm studying journalism, I'm always saying, oh, nice as well, but my eyes are saying, what is wrong with you? Mm-hmm. Something like this. So my question is, do you have in the US mental health trainings, especially for journalists? What kind of trainings and who is initiating them?
Yeah, there's no standard, but it's more common now because the topic matter in journalism is often fraught, sometimes traumatizing. We have this phenomenon in the US of mass shootings, and the journalists who cover those often end up as traumatized as a war reporter. So their outlets will often provide counseling. I think it's usually instituted by the human resources departments of those institutions in order to keep the workplace sustainable. Ideally, you need those people to come back and do their job again, even if it means going back into a shooting zone or to cover an election that has become extremely poisonous with toxic ideas. And journalists themselves, in no sort of organized form or fashion, are becoming more open, either within their outlets or on their own social media, about the toll that some of the harder parts of the job have taken on them, and to try to demystify and take the stigma away from the idea of sort of seeking mental health therapy because of your job. And I think the effect has been generally good, and more and more journalists avail themselves of services like those, and there's very little, maybe none. There's like no price to be paid within the industry for taking advantage of those things. But it's not a standard. It's like our company, I don't believe, has a like its own internal mental health issue. We just encourage people who need to take time to do that, or if they need to talk to someone to do that, and we could even help arrange it.
A question there in the middle, and then.
Hello, Emilia Slavova, Sofia University. I'm a linguist, sociolinguist, and I'm very happy that you mentioned the truth sandwich, which actually comes from George Lakoff, who is also a linguist.
That's right.
And it's something that I've been trying to share with Bulgarian journalists in my subversive ways, usually commenting underneath their Facebook pages, and I always shout, please use the truth sandwich here. Probably this is not something you can easily do in a live interview, but it's very easy to do when you report headlines what somebody said, like Lavrov said, NATO invaded us on the territory of Ukraine. Do you need to post this as the headline of your story? There are so many ways to surround it and to give context and to explain that this is a blatant lie. So I would like to tell all colleagues, journalists here, think about the headlines. Most people read the headlines only. Don't quote people who are obviously lying for what they're saying. And yes, use the truth sandwich.
I agree. And implicit in the term truth sandwich is that, you know, somebody like Lavrov, you can't wish him out of existence, and you can't do journalism by omitting everything he says, every lie he tells. The fact that he's out there lying is very important. So it's about how to make sure that he doesn't get what he's after, which is to mislead. And whether you embed it in a, you know, sandwich the way George Lakoff advised, or just otherwise, there's so, as you said, there's just so many ways to convey that somebody important said something for nefarious purposes that was untrue, as opposed to just repeating what they said. And it really ought not be such a challenge for journalists to get this right almost every time. But they're learning on the job, as you know, as I was saying. This is the extent of it, and the sort of bald-facedness of it is new in a U.S. context, and so many of our working journalists are not used to it, and they're doing things the way they did when things were slightly more anchored in truth, or the expectation was at least, and the consequences are often galling. These headlines that simply just repeat a false claim, and often that's all that somebody will read.
Question here in the front row or second row.
Orlin, but if we imagine that Twitter starts moderating content in favor of Trump and the Republican Party, how will you deal with that? I'm asking because in Bulgaria we have such a problem with other social networks.
Yeah, you know, how do we deal with it? I mean, there's not much we can do about it. We can report on it happening. Our social media before the Musk purchased Twitter is the algorithms are meant to pick out stories or content that fosters engagement. What fosters engagement? Things that make people angry, things that are outrageous, right? And so the politicians who traffic in that kind of content are already, you know, it's not that somebody is behind the scenes like making sure that the worst politicians are getting the most attention on social media, but they've written the algorithm in a way that the worst kinds of people just do end up getting that kind of attention. So it's not totally clear to me how much different the world would be if Elon Musk decided he just wanted to pick his favorite politician and you know, make that person the star of Twitter all the time, versus what just happens the way Twitter works to begin with, which is that, you know, to take Donald Trump, the example you gave, he was kicked off of Twitter. Musk has let him back on, but because in the meantime he started his own social media company, he hasn't been using Twitter per se. But if he started, it would be just like during his presidency. It would be nonstop cascade of farrago of lies, and all those would end up with tons of engagement, and then they'd be put on television news just like they were before, and that would happen even without Musk deciding affirmatively that he wanted to see more of that. Which is to say, so we're kind of living in that world anyway, and you know, what you do about it is just, you know, your job well, and you know, try to foster sources within the tech community to understand how it's happening and why, and you can bring that to the public too. And you know, the more people are aware of how their social media services are manipulating them or exploiting them, the better, and hopefully the more like the more circumspect they'll be about what they're picking up from their phones, basically.
We have time for about one or two more questions. You get that, Tim?
Hello, thank you. My name is Frank Stier. I'm a German journalist. In the last years, we talked a lot about disinformation. We talked, or you talked also today. I wonder whether there is some aspects of disinformation we may talk not enough in the last years. We had a pandemic for 2-3 years, and I wonder whether in this time media journalists made also some serious mistakes. When a US president claimed the elections were stolen, we all agreed he lied and this is disinformation. When another US president said, get your shot and you will not be infected, the people who claimed, wait, Mr. President, maybe there is not enough evidence for your claim, they were called from mainstream media anti-vaxxers. In the beginning of the pandemic, when there were people who said the virus may not be natural, but there may be a lab leak, these people were called conspiracionists. In the last few weeks, there are new emails made public by the Freedom of Information Act who show that the scientists in the beginning, in the February of 2020, they discussed the lab leak theory seriously. So my question to you is there not the time for discussion amongst us journalists, among the mainstream media, whether this was right when the mainstream media willingly supported the narrative of the politicians. Every critics of lockdown measures were corona deniers. Every skeptics concerning the vaccines were anti-vaxxers. These people who wanted to know where comes this virus from were conspiracionists. It was right to say the virus is natural. We don't come out of the pandemic if we don't get vaccinated, the whole people on the planet. We have to lock down the whole societies to be safe and healthy. So my question to you, is it time to lead a critical discussion amongst not only journalists, of course, also politicians, whether all these claims, anti-vaxxers, corona deniers, conspiracionists, whether this was right to call people in this way?
Let me try to answer the question at a very general level, which is that in my career, there have been, on a large number of issues, important ones, long predating coronavirus, institutional failures, sort of echo chamber effects, where if you look back on how a topic was reported in the light of new information, that people were taking it in, and I don't think that that's specifically what happened with coronavirus, but just to talk about the general point. And every time that happens, there's a clamor for journalists to reckon with what they did, for some introspection, for them to adopt new practices or tighten existing ones, so that they don't repeat the same mistakes in the future. And we have a mixed record in general of our big institutional journalism outlets reflecting critically on their own mistakes. On the coronavirus topic specifically, speaking off the cuff, I don't want to say anything that turns out to not be true. My understanding, and I think what journalists should, and I think generally do, try to report when this topic of the origin of the virus arises, is that there is no smoking gun that allows you to know either way, and there are many scientists who say one thing and others who think something else, but neither of them knows with any certainty. And that's sort of all that a journalist can do. We had in our country a brief dust up over this question that I did think ended up in a somewhat unproductive place, which is that because of how the president mismanaged the earliest days of the pandemic. There are members of his party that wanted to absolve him by casting blame for what happened anywhere else. And a big part of the sensation of this topic of whether it was a lab origin or not originated with members of his party trying to just divert public criticism of him to anywhere else. And what journalists, some did in response, because they wanted to be careful not to play into that effort to divert criticism, said this is, this is beyond the pale. When what they should have said is, we don't know what the truth is, but this person is making claims that he can't substantiate in order to protect a political ally of his. That would have been, I think, a better way to go about it. And in sort of the cold light of 2020 hindsight, in 2020 hindsight, we might be able to have another one of these rounds of public conversation about how well or poorly journalists did and what they could change about their practices so that if there's another pandemic or any other kind of mass global event that requires them to do better, that they don't make those mistakes again. I hope that answers the question, which I want to try to answer in the most general possible way, because media failures do happen, and it's important for journalists to recognize when they do.
Well, thank you, Brian, and thank you for all the good questions.